to me as these five objectives: critical understanding of colonial impact,
rediscovery and reclamation of indigenous thought, promoting epistemic plurality, rethinking education and curriculum, and contemporary relevance and future pathways. Collectively, they delineate a logical arc of analysis and synthesis, followed by metamorphosis that will be required to use insights and inspirations drawn from our past to shape a future that combines the best of our heritage to realize our locust aspiration. So, like all educators, we are in this business because we are optimists and we believe that the next generation has the potential to be better than us. And so, our efforts are always oriented around in the future. And as educators, we have a duty to provide our students with an intellectual toolkit with which to ford the unknown crossings that lie ahead. We don't know what rivers they will have to cross, how they will cross it. So we do not know the way to traverse. So do's and don'ts will clearly not suffice. Rather, we have to give them some compass, some guiding principles rather than formulas or recipes. And for that, as we all know as educators, a person's sense of self
and of one's place in the world
and of one's place in the world and of the right and wrong ways to proceed, given the circumstances at hand, those are the essential tools. So where do we start constructing this sort of guidance? Because I'm not sure that today
any of us here
any of us here
would stand up and say,
would stand up and say, I know the way, we must do things this way. I think this seminar is very timely because decolonization is a multi-generational process. As the generation that was alive at independence slowly starts to fade away, people of my age who were born after independence, I was born in 1958, 11 years after independence, so I'm most decidedly a post-independence baby. I think we are perhaps the first people who can really step back and ask ourselves, what exactly is decolonizing? How do we go about it? Because at least we weren't brought up in a country where the sign read dogs and Indians not allowed. My father was born in a country where outside Raj Bhavan in Kolkata, there was a sign in the public part opposite Raj Bhavan which said dogs and Indians not allowed. I have a photograph of that somewhere in my in my archives. I wasn't born into that environment. So in the Indian context, particularly for our generation and perhaps for people who are younger than us, where do we even start? And I guess we can start by, today at least I want to start by examining the concept of decolonizing. So what in this Indian context we have today, in fact in this very session, does it mean to decolonize? I'm speaking to you in a colonial language, English, which actually, given that it starts with an E, I hold that it will be pronounced as English. I am not English. The language I'm using for this talk is probably best described as English, which is pronounced as spelled I, that is with an I at the beginning. And occasionally I may lapse into English, which is English sprinkled with a liberal dose of literal translation of Bengali metaphors and imagery, because my mind was constituted in the soil and the air and the water of Bengal. And then because my mother is a native Hindi speaker, you will experience occasional bursts of English as well in my speech, which add their own distinctive spice. So my question is to decolonize. My question to myself is to decolonize. Should I abandon English, or should I continue to joyously and unselfconsciously forge ahead using whatever variant of the motherlish tongue that I have at my disposal, because it's my birthright to express my thoughts as I think they are best, stated and simmered. So I would argue that the only sane position is for us to say, no, we are inheritors to everything, including the experience of colony, as well as our pre-colonial heritage. And we should enjoy everything, and we should mix and match and blend. And that is going to be the main theme of the rest of my remarks. That only sane option today is to embrace everything, including the influence of colony. Because physics tells us that our ride on the arrow of time is a one-way journey. we cannot unwrite what the finger of time has written. We do, however, have the freedom, indeed obligation, especially those of us who consider ourselves educators. We have a bounded obligation to reinterpret it as we go along our journey. Hindsight is nothing to sneeze at. It's nothing to avoid. It's the task of forging ahead with hindsight as a guide that allows us to better engage our problems intelligently. My point here is that who we are, our very consciousness, has forever been altered by 300 years of close interaction with the West, what we call colonization, and the effects cannot be undone. The Macaulay program has forever changed who we are and who we will become. To eradicate its root and stock is simply infeasible and an undesirable enterprise. It's just rebarbative. It is unproductive, it is backward-looking, it is regressive. Our consciousness is a product of our times and our world as we have found it. It is not that of our ancestors around 1600, when the European presence in the Indosphere became a measurable factor, let alone talking about 600 BCE, the time of Buddha and Mahavir, or 1600 BCE, which is the sort of the beginning of the Vedic era. So, to put it another way, we are not our parents, to say nothing of generations before. As the world has changed, so have we, and our values and aspirations reflect our times and the environment in which we have grown up. Why is this important? Because over the 3 centuries of interaction with the West, the Indian experience of colony, at least to my view, stands sui generis. When Europeans, by which I mean the British largely, came to India, they found something novel, something rich, something old, stunning variety of thoughts and practices that had something in common and yet were also incomprehensibly variegated. The British just couldn't make sense of it. They had to exercise their temporal and
power. They had to make sense of the country, and they just could not. In fact, they tried their very best. They saw unity in diversity. They saw a grading of diverse traditions, of different views and textures that looked different with every examination. They came to grips with the experience, and it changed them. The coming to grips with the experience of India changed the colonizers themselves immeasurably. And perhaps more than the colonized, I was in London for about a week, my first extended trip to London. And I walked around, we must have walked at least 50 miles over 5 days, possibly more. And everywhere I could see the stains of Indian money. It is the revenue from India that made London London. That 300-year interaction affected Britain, and because of Britain's preeminent status in European society, within that same time frame, it affected European society, it affected the world. And it seems to me rather ironic that for Indians who were the colonized, the respect with which British beheld Indian civilization, particularly the deep past versions of it, to wit, the work of the Asiatic society, the work of people like William Jones, the work of people like Max Muller subsequently. These are Europeans doing this work. The Indians really had very regard for our own tradition and heritage in that time frame. I'm talking about the 1700s, 1800s, well into the 1800s. So it's only the introduction of university education and the creation of the presidency universities that led to the creation of an Indian consciousness and eventually to the formation of the Indian National Congress and the nationalist perspective. So it's very ironic for me that as an Indian, the respect with which the British beheld Indian civilization, it seems to me that drives our current desire to reclaim that glorious deep past heritage. And that is, in a sense, a continuation of the colonial point of view. So even the Indian knowledge system concept and the whole idea that there is a deep trove of knowledge that somehow exists, that continues to be particularly relevant to our life today, seems to me something worth examining closely. In fact, I don't think it's too far-fetched to argue that had the British not respected our deep past, today would we be harkening back to it with nearly as much fervor as we seem to be doing? So this is a very interesting paradox to me. The recognition that our fascination with the deep past, especially the Vedic trench of Indian culture, is it to a large extent a continuation of the colonial perspective on Indian culture? How does that affect our color, our decolonization efforts? Does it open the door to reevaluating how much relevance an agrarian pastoral Vedic culture that touted wealth in cows and horses and glorified a warrior aristocracy had to our identity as citizens of a modern, democratic, secular, and egalitarian society? To me, this is a central question that I face today when I look at our sort of approach to reclaiming our ancestral heritage, the whole concept of Indian knowledge system, the topics that have been chosen as the focal point of potential courses, all those things, we are as academics, those are the things we love to argue about, right? And so, quite honestly, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about how relevant are the ideals and norms enshrined in Vedic culture to who we are today? Or are they simply historical artifacts that were beliefs of our forefathers that should be viewed with a certain intellectual distance and removed, recognizing that we are not them? Our contemporary believes in the scientific method as the only reliable source of intersubjectively agreed upon understanding of the world around us. At the end of the day, it has to meet approval from the scientific method if it is to be a statement about the world as it exists. So this empirical focus, it's quite at odds with the norms of Vedic culture. So while there is the Atharva Veda and there are rudimentary elements of let's say medical sciences in our ancient texts, do they really map onto the way we think today? That is a question that we have to face. Because we also have a taste for representative democracy. No Indian is willing to give up the vote today. We have a taste for secularism. We believe in egalitarianism, as in all citizens are equal. So these are foundational norms for the body politic. How well do they meld with indigenous Indian thought? Well, in indigenous Indian thought can be find roots or even precursors of similar ideas. Or if we go back to our indigenous knowledge traditions, should we try to detach from Western or colonial notions of representative democracy, because that is very definitely a Western innovation, or secularism, or egalitarianism, and seek out wholly new, wholly different organizing principles or even concepts that should be even, not event, even concepts for the social order that we aspire to create. Because one thing as educators we know, what we teach today is what our students will use to live in the world and to create the world of tomorrow. So in that way, the classroom is the crucible in which the citizen of the future is formed. And however we approach this task of decolonizing, and however we approach the task of incorporating insights and inspiration from our indigenous traditions, these are very delicate issues that I believe it's our duty as academics to explore very carefully before we decide which path to follow. It's a big challenge. And so I think that seen in this way, this conference, this seminar, is really sort of has done a superb job of hitting the problem dead on. The challenge before us, our generation and the next generation of educators, is disentangling these very complicated issues, to which I personally don't have an answer. But I'm going to try to throw something out, which I've been thinking about for a while, to see how you as an audience respond to it. So here I want to go back to thinking about the way our culture has evolved, and in that evolution, the historical experience offered by the Saman tradition and serve as a valuable starting point for such a conversation around who we see us as being and what we see us as becoming. The reason say simply that the emergence of the Saman traditions was an emphatic rejection of the Vedic culture that preceded it. It is the first intellectual revolution in Indian thought that we are aware of, that is well documented, and for which we have a lot of information, and on which over the last 150 years a vast amount of scholarship has been devoted. So it's a reliably well documented revolution in Indian thought, where long before the advent of Christianity, long before the rise of the West, long before the arrival of Islam, Indians themselves are grappling with their cultural heritage, which is the Vedic culture at that time, and they're saying, who are we, what do we see ourselves as, and what do we want to become? So, if you recall, just a quick historical note, that the rise of the Janapadas, after the decline of the Harappan civilization, there's a black period in Indian history which is often attributed to the Aryan influx. Now, I don't have a position on that because it's not my field of expertise. So, I'll simply say the rise of the Janapads and their primarily agrarian nature was the crucible in which Vedic culture evolved. But eventually, the prosperity of these societies led to the emergence of new urban centers, where trade enriched and empowered the merchant classes in unprecedented ways, leading to a rejection of rigid Vedic hierarchies, which had assigned the merchants a socially inferior position. Now, this sort of stuff is old stuff to most of you. You probably read it in your master's or your PhD curriculum, and you can see here traces of the work of scholars of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and I can give you some citations, some of my favorite readings from this time. But the bottom line is that around 800 to 500 before Common Era, there was a huge revolution in Indian thought. It's the first well-documented revolution, intellectual revolution in our tradition. So maybe we can go back to that and ask ourselves what the hell was going on there, because it might offer us some insights into our current situation. So it's strictly going in the historical batting order. The Samans were the first revolutionaries, the first bomb throwers in the Indian intellectual tradition, and that's the reason I think that we might as well start there, asking how did they reorder things? And the Saman traditions basically upended and caused a radical reordering of the organization of society by rejecting the strict stratification imposed by the Vedic order, by emphasizing a godless or Gnostic view of the universe. The idea that the material universe is conceived of as an eternal, self-created, cyclical, spatio-temporal construct in which souls bonded to the universe by their karmic endowments seek liberation from the cycle of birth and death. Can you imagine how revolutionary this must have been in 800 BC? The Saman view totally denies the social ordering explicit in the caste system. It dispenses with the need for gods to impose a moral order on society. And it says also they're fundamentally equal because they all have the potential to achieve liberation if they follow certain overarching principles, at the core of which lie the notions of empathy and a generalized sense of mutual regard. The Jains have a saying, "Paraspara upagrah jivana," which many Jains believe is really the essence of all that is truly Jain. And it translates roughly as the true nature, or you can call it the supreme duty of the soul, is to seek mutual welfare. I seek your welfare, you seek my welfare. Surely that is the organizing principle of any modern society that one would want to live in. So I think that these kinds of ideas are there in a different form. And we as academics could do a lot to kind of better map these proto-concepts or these early innovations into the modern context so that our students whom we are training to deal with the future, they leave the classroom better grounded to really forge a new identity which does not have the same sort of angst that leads us to consider propositions such as decolonizing. Decolonizing is the fascination of a traumatized mind in some sense. It's a mind that feels that something has been imposed on it instead of saying, this is all mine. So I think true liberation from that burden that colonization has imposed on our minds would be when, following Rabindranath, we would say all of human heritage is mine and I belong to all of humanity. So in many ways, to me, this universality and the sense of I am part of the whole is part of me, that finds its first expression in the Saman point of view. So in the case of the Jain tradition, with which I am more familiar, and I don't know how well I'm doing on time, but I think I hope I have time to let me know if I'm when I have 5 minutes left. Please let me know, and I'll jump to my conclusion. So in the case of Jain traditions, with which I'm more familiar, these foundational insights that the supreme beauty of the soul, of the enlightened soul, I should say not enlightened but awakened soul, is to seek mutual welfare. Is that the nature and causes of dukkha or suffering which the soul must endure lead to moral guidelines, ahimsa, non-violence, and apagrah, non-attachment. Which,
Professor Dugar, I'm so sorry to interrupt you, but I think you have about 5 minutes, and then you can probably start concluding.
Oh, okay, all right, thank you. So which when scrupulously adhered to, and I would say that usually they are presented with a suitable coating of religious faith, because it's essential to ensure the community identity. So the religious leaders of the Jain community, the way it's organized, they have a vested interest in ensuring the continuation of the identity of the Jain community as a distinct entity. And as a business professor, I understand about business practice when I see one market segmentation at work here. But if we remove the faith-based component and just look at the moral guidelines themselves as abstract principles, not necessarily grounded in all the rest of the Jain orthodox, religious orthodoxy, there are vast literatures on these two central moral injunctions: abstinence from violence and the cultivation of non-attachment. And they are an ideal source, a very rich, even ideal source of teaching material that can be usefully harnessed to cultivate an intellectual mindset that values reasoning and emphasizes the central role of norms of social and moral symmetry. You see, I personally feel that the Saman religions, both Jainism and Buddhism, and also some of the other traditions that were started at that time but did not survive, they emphasize the role of reasoning, and there is a certain dissatisfaction with the kind of orthodoxy that posits a divine or supernatural source. Rather, the Saman traditions are based on norms of social and moral symmetry. Most particularly, the principle of ahimsa embodies to an extreme degree reverence for life in all its forms. It's something that modern perspectives of ecology emphasize with increasing urgency: the systemic nature and the fact that all elements within the system have a niche in which they are essential. That's a very modern sensibility, and aparigraha enjoins us to step back from self-interest and consider the welfare of all, not just of the self, in deciding on the right course of action. This kind of systemic, neutral, disinterested, out of one's own self, as it were, emphasis on identifying the right thing to do, the correct course of action, is the quintessential contribution of Saman tradition. Right achar, that is conduct, is essential, and if it conforms to the moral imperatives of ahimsa and aparigraha, it is all you need to annihilate your karma And it is the sole pathway through which the yearning of the soul for liberation can be consummated. Rather than the order and the yajna offered to the god, just peace for deliverance into a future birth, which is sort of the hallmark of a Vedic desire for future upliftment or for upliftment in a future birth. And here, I suppose the Upanishads actually take a much more sophisticated view. I can see that. But the original Vedic desire of future upliftment in a future birth has been sublimated by the Sramans into a moral code of mutual concern and consideration that leads to the supreme payoff, which is the liberation of the soul. So whether or not one posits the existence of a soul, which is a very disputed idea, really positing the idea that to cause suffering to another is to cause suffering to oneself, right? The circularity of the mechanism. We don't need to know the details of the mechanism. All we need to know is that it's a feedback loop. What goes around comes around. Is likely to discipline the conversation we have about choices over actions in the private sphere or about policy choice in the public domain in ways that are critical today, which is the need to prevent differences of opinion between us from turning into vociferous disputes that will tear apart our society. And that kind of fundamentalist thinking, where if you don't agree with me, then I don't need to talk to you, that is a wave that is sweeping the world today. And it is fundamentally antithetical to the maintenance of a healthy society. So I think that when one starts to think of the system as a closed loop, where what I do to you immediately turns around and I do to myself as well, it will force people to think about hypotheticals. If I do this, or under these circumstances, if I were to adopt this course of action, and that's very valuable training, as you know. The Gedanken experiment that we do in the classroom, no matter what discipline we teach, it trains the mind to liberate itself from mundane realism. One can always get lost in the specific details of a given situation. This is a disease that is endemic among what we Bengalis call intellectuals. You know the definition of intellectual in Bengali, right? A person whose intellect resides in their chual or their lower jaw. And with certain other narrow-minded folks called the chattering classes. So intellectuals generally tend to make the problem more complicated. But wisdom requires us to simplify, to create abstractions that help us to better discriminate between the choices at hand. And secondly, just encouraging this kind of conversation in the classroom forces people to consider alternative positions other than what they might hold personally, which is a beautiful way I found in the classroom to put someone to argue a position in which they do not personally believe. I find it to be a very useful classroom exercise, and I often do that deliberately. Even in my undergraduate classes. It's pretty standard in graduate classes, but even in my undergraduate classes, I do this because I find that it fosters understanding and a degree of empathy for each other's positions. So for these reasons, I believe that the Sraman traditions, in their attempt to replace the theocratic view of the world as a manifestation of the divine, were the earliest attempts by Indians that we know of to reconceptualize the self and its relation to the world around certain principles that are of central importance in the creation of a society that better serves the ends of personal freedom, equity, and justice, and the ultimate objective of any healthy society, which is to inculcate among its citizens a deep and abiding concern for mutual welfare, or as the Jains have put it, Parasparopagnaho Divana. So I think my main message would be that if we think about the way to leverage our indigenous intellectual traditions into workable material that will help us forge a new India that lives up to what we now consider to be an ideal society. And it's important, it would be very valuable, I think, to devise curricular materials that incorporate the Sraman perspective and the challenges they pose to their predecessor perspective, and help the students understand how the responses to these challenges evolved over the succeeding 2 millennia. Because the Vedic perspective did not go away, the Upanishadic perspective did not go away. It came back, and after the Sraman revolution had swept India, the Vedic perspective came back. It was resuscitated. It responded to the intellectual challenges of the Sraman perspective. It devised its own responses. And merrily the roundabout kept going. And then Islam came, and both the Sraman perspective and the Vedic perspective had to respond to Islam. And the Bhakti movement came about. So you see, the threads that were, the forces that were let loose by the Sraman revolution continued to influence the texture and the hues of Indian thought in the succeeding centuries, in the succeeding 2 millennia, as it were, today. So understand, and so developing curricular materials that expose our students to this intellectual theater, this drama, the intellectual gymnastics that have shaped the pre-colonial milieu that confronted our colonizers, and in turn that shaped the colonial experience itself, would be a very valuable exercise for Indian academics and the Indian academy. I think that this conference, and the ideas that we have been exchanging, hopefully they'll influence us all, and together we can pursue this task of creating a body of curricular material that exposes our students to the entire spectrum of perspectives, and also to the ugly side, which I have not touched upon, because there also is our heritage is not all beautiful, and I don't want to put that in writing. So I'll just add that we should all be painfully conscious that the intellectual riches that our philosophical traditions unleashed or unlocked for us also have unleashed from time to time extremely unpalatable interactions among different groups. Long before Islam, long before colonialism came to Indian shores, our ancestors have been doing very ugly things to each other. Our students deserve to also know that truth. So melding all of this together, the warts and the beauty, I think, is the challenge before us as academics, if we are truly to kind of live up to the needs of the day. And I think with that, I'll stop. Thank you for your patience, and thank you for letting me run over my time limit if I did so.
Thank you, Dr. Dugar, for your words and thank you, Dr. Dugar, for your deliberations. And what I got from your talk was you are advocating some generosity of spirit, and that's something that I'm sure we can all agree with. And it occurs to me that obviously something that we should be aware of is that when the first universities were set up in the subcontinent, they were set up by the Buddhist Saint-James. So therefore, that is also something that we should probably remember that our learning comes from subcontinent primarily with the Saint-James in the institutionalized university form. And of course, you're talking about the liberation of the sect, which is something that we should also remind ourselves. And one of the traditions in the Jain community that I personally find literally moving is the Jain day of contrition, or the Jain asking for forgiveness. That is something that I think many religious traditions have, and I think it's so wonderful. They actually take one day out to just ask for forgiveness, and I think that speaks to us a lot of spirit. I think it's very, very precious and something that we can't lose. With those remarks, the presentation is now open to questions, so if anybody would like to ask Dr. Dugar any questions, we put them for this mic as circulating. Is there a question? Okay. So in that case, thank you so much, Dr. Dugar, for the presentation, which I thought was extremely important. I'm sure it's going to take the discussion forward. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us for this one.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your
এবার প্রেজেন্টেশন শেষে আমি অডিয়েবল এবার প্রেজেন্টেশন শেষে যারা রয়েছেন 3 মিনিট প্রত্যেকের টাইম, তার বেশি নেবেন না, তাহলে কিন্তু পেপার প্রেজেন্টেশনে যে অ্যাওয়ার্ডটা আছে তার জন্য ডিসকোয়ালিফাই হবেন। রুমি রানী সাহু আছেন? রুমি রানী সাহু থাকলে একটু রেসপন্স করবেন। নেই। অভিজিৎ বড়াই, শুরু করুন আপনার প্রেজেন্টেশন।
Good afternoon to all the Indian dignitaries and presenters. I am Ojit Brai. I am going to present a paper titled Beyond Nationalism, a post-colonial study of Tagore's nationalism in India. As politics takes a right-wing turn in several countries around the world, the idea of nationalism is being debated anew. From the traditional understanding of nationalism as being bounded by ideas like culture and territory, the discourse now leads to seek to more complex ideas and reflections on nationalism. Nationalism that is dependent on the identification and demonization of the other, be it another country or another community, is obviously divisive and helps to foment a culture of violence. We are going to examine the essay Nationalism in India by Rabindranath Tagore in the period context, where he enumerates the pitfalls of nationalism, both hyper and blind. Tagore begins his essay by striking at the heart of the matter with criticism. Our real problem in India is not political, it is social. This is a condition not only prevailing in India, but among all nations. Because of India is blindly following the West's political approach, as it will be tenable in India. In Europe, racial unity and homogeneity help them to form powerful nations who blunder the world at will. In India, despite this good diversity, we have sought some basis of unity through our sense, like now, Kobe, Switzerland, and others, preaching one or all this movement. In the world of Europe, what India has been the whole world now. The whole world is becoming one country through simultaneously. And the moment we arrive, when we also want to find a basis for unity, we is equality. The moment it really underscores the fact that what truly matters is that we are all human beings, irrespective of our political or national identity. Then these people extremely find that we should balance between globalism and compromise. Those people who collaborated on this in some way and national experience. Unlike India, Europe did not face the race problem and it was inhibited by homogeneous white bodies and if they came in contact with the different race, they simplified the problem by also seeing instrument in the address of the relative of Australia and India on the other hand provided different of basis for the first and the fastest time was coming out maintaining the different between races by creating different roles for it. However, no stable. What we fail to realize is that improving these differences are not by the physical barrier of objects, which however they are showing with life. So the solution of our table because this is simple. Let our life be simple is our aspect and this is in a game. Let our civilization make it constant along the basis of social cooperation and not on the economic exploitation and not.
Thank you so much. Next presenter, Sri Rabindranath Hasda. ভিডিওটা অন করবেন এবং ভিডিওটা যারা যখন বলবেন যেই বলবেন প্রেজেন্টার্স প্লিজ অন ইউর ভিডিও ক্যামেরা অ্যান্ড প্লিজ কমপ্লিট উইদিন 3 মিনিটস। শুরু করো। আচ্ছা, ভিডিও ক্যামেরাটা অন করবেন। ভিডিও ক্যামেরা একটু সমস্যা আছে কারণ আমি ট্রাভেল করছি তো সেই অবস্থাতে আছে এই টপিকে করছি হয়তো নেটের সমস্যা হবে ওই কারণে আমি ভিডিওটা অন করতে পারছি না এই জন্য দুঃখিত। আজকে আমার আলোচনার বিষয় হচ্ছে আদিবাসী জীবন, আদিবাসী জীবিকা, আদিবাসী সংস্কৃতিতে তারপরে ভাবনাটা কিভাবে আছে সেটাই আমি আমার এই রচনার মাধ্যমে তুলে ধরার চেষ্টা করেছি। আচ্ছা, কিভাবে ঔপনিবেশিকতা এসে আদিবাসী ভারতীয় চিন্তাধারাকে প্রভাবিত করে আদিবাসী চিন্তাধারাগুলোকে অনেকটা টানতে নেওয়ার মতো বা বলা যায় আদিবাসী ভারতীয় চিন্তাধারায় ঔপনিবেশিকতার প্রভাব কিভাবে শাস্তি করছে সেগুলোই আমি দেখানোর চেষ্টা করছি। তাতে ভালো হয়েছে না মন্দ হয়েছে সেগুলো আমার আলোচনাতে উঠে এসেছে। তো কিভাবে তাৎপর্যের ভাবনা আগে ভারতীয় সমাজ ব্যবস্থাকে চালনা করেছে যখন এটা আইন ছিল না। আইন তো কোম্পানি আসার পরে ভারতবর্ষে আইন এসছে সংবিধান এসছে তার আগে তাদের মানুষ ওই কাপড়কে মেনেই জীবন ধারণ করতো। তারা প্রতি পদে পদে কাপড়কে মেনে করার চেষ্টা করতো কেন না তাতে সমাজের ভালো হবে, সংস্কৃতি ভালো হবে। যাই হোক, যখন এদেশে আইনের শাসন ছিল না তখন মানুষের কাছে কাবুই ছিল সবকিছু, তার কাবুই ছিল ঐক্য আইনের মতো। তো তারপরে যেমন পরিবেশ ভাবনাও ছিল তেমন সমাজ ভাবনাও তার মধ্যে উঠেছে। যেমন পরিবেশ ভাবনার কথা বলতে গেলে আদিবাসী তাদের বিশেষ করে অরণ্য সম্প্রদায়কে মহাপাপ বলে ঘোষণা করা হতো। এই অরণ্যকে ধ্বংস করা যাবে না কেন? পরিবেশ আছে বলেই জীবজগৎ আছে, তো পরিবেশ না থাকলে জীবজগৎ সেই প্রভাব জীবজগতের কাছে এসে আগে করবেন। এছাড়া আরো কিছু কিছু ব্যাপার আছে যেমন ধরতির বুকে খাল চালানা, এটা আদিবাসী তাদের বিরুদ্ধ ছিল। এমনকি এই পৃথিবীর বুকে আঁকিমুখী আঁকা তারা করতো না, কারণ ওটা ওখানে নিষিদ্ধ ছিল। তো সেখানে খনন, বিশেষ করে পেন্টি পাইলাগুলো খনন করা হচ্ছে, সেই খনন তো কঠোরভাবে নিষিদ্ধ করা যায়। ওই কারণেই হয়তো কোম্পানির সঙ্গে এই সমাজের মানুষের সংঘাত একটা সময় অবধারিত হয়ে যায়। তো যাই হোক, এদের চাপে আরো কিছু কিছু নিষিদ্ধের কথা আছে, যেমন কৃষিকাজের নামে দোলা, পাট করা, কাটা, শ্রমিক ধ্বংস করা, পাহাড় করা, গাছ কাটা, তারপরে কাটতেও ওরা নিষেধ করে, যেগুলো রাসায়নিক সার ব্যবহার, ফসলের কীটনাশক ব্যবহার, এগুলো স্বাস্থ্য সচেতনতার কথা হবে তাদের কারণে নিষিদ্ধ ছিল। এবার একটু আসা যাক প্রথম কথায়, প্রকৃতি না প্রকৃতি না পুরো বলে বিশ্বাস করে। আচ্ছা, ঠিক আছে। প্রোটিন বা পুনর্জতা এরা প্লাস্টিক পুনর্জতা বলে যেমন বিশ্বাস করে তেমন সমগ্র জীবজগৎ যা আছে পশু পাখি সমস্ত কিছুকে পুনর্জতা বলে চিহ্নিত করেছে আর হচ্ছে মান্যতা দিয়ে চলেছে আজও। তার পিছনে একটি কারণ যে বিলুপ্ততা থাকতে তাদের যেমন বাঁচিয়ে রাখতে হবে, ওনাদের তো পরিবেশের ভারসাম্য হারিয়ে দেবে। তো এইটার কথাই আমি আমার এই নিবন্ধে বিশেষ করে তুলে ধরার চেষ্টা করেছি। ঠিক আছে, আমি শেষ করছি। সঞ্জয় পাটিয়া আসছেন, এরপরে আমি ডক্টর কৃষ্ণেন রায়কে
I am speaking on the theme decolonizing the curriculum. Colonization is and how integration can meaningfully integrate into curriculum. The colonial era of the India, which is from educational transfer, was the principal religions were given by indigenous system of curriculum. It is the experience and by the right to curriculum methods, the long term state of education is students. The effect of colonialism is curriculum of indigenous institutional workers and passers. The which means we are going to get a process of Indian journey, but segmented. We can find the and there are planet of on their own culture and different rules. In post-colonial education, after this, Indian education is becoming individual sovereign. Equalizing the curriculum is not about making the way, but of distributing